Hey, so here's some good news that you may not have heard anywhere else. Good news in terms of us being a small d democracy. So as a general matter, one big fundamental threat to democracy and the rule of law is when the justice system, when law enforcement has to bow to the powerful. When prosecutors who investigate powerful people or who bring charges against powerful people find themselves targeted for doing so. When prosecutors learn to expect that if you investigate or indict someone with political power, that will likely get you attacked and potentially removed from your job, that dynamic is a very dangerous, very corrosive thing to the rule of law and therefore to democracy. And this past year, Republicans in the great state of Georgia gave themselves the ability to pursue that exact course of action. Around the time that the high-profile, high-stakes investigation of former President Donald Trump was starting to bear fruit in the state of Georgia, the Republican-dominated legislature in that state drafted a new law, giving themselves new power, giving themselves a new commission that they would populate, that they would direct. And that commission would have the power to remove prosecutors in the middle of their terms in office. And the legislators who proposed this, some of them at least, were not shy about saying explicitly that the purpose of this, or at least their intent once this thing passed, would be to use it to go after Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who has been leading the giant racketeering prosecution against former President Trump for allegedly interfering in Georgia's elections. They've given themselves the power, effectively, to remove prosecutors. And they did so right when a prosecutor brought charges against Donald Trump. Are they going to try to use it? Well, we might just have gotten an answer to that question very quietly on Thanksgiving Eve, while almost no one was looking. A very big deal thing happened in Georgia. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled on this issue. And they said that this law that the Republicans passed that effectively gave them the ability to remove prosecutors, the Supreme Court said that this law cannot work as written. The court fundamentally declined to approve specific rules for how this commission would function in the real world. That decision has the practical effect of at least looking like it might kill this effort to oust Fani Willis as the Fulton County prosecutor, unless Georgia Republican lawmakers go back to the drawing board and kind of start over with this thing. Here's how the Atlanta Journal-Constitution described it. Quote, the Georgia Supreme Court said it will not approve rules and regulations for a new state commission empowered to sanction prosecutors, effectively rendering moot a law backed by Governor Brian Kemp and other top Republicans until lawmakers overhaul the measure. Oh, wait, they can still overhaul the measure? Are they going to try to do that? Joining us now is Professor Clark Cunningham. He's a professor of law at Georgia State University. He's an expert in legal ethics and constitutional law, and he is a professor we have called on in the past to help us understand this dynamic at Georgia. Professor Cunningham, I'm really grateful you could be here tonight. Thanks for your time.
Glad to be with you, Rachel.
So the ruling from the Supreme Court on Thanksgiving Eve on Wednesday effectively said, we do not believe that we as the court have the power to establish the rules by which this commission would do this work. Is that a fair layman's way to summarize what they did?
Yeah, I think that's true. The law that was passed by the Georgia legislature last spring provided that the rules that would put the commission into business had to be first approved by the Georgia Supreme Court. And the Georgia Supreme Court announced on Thanksgiving Eve that they weren't going to do that. And therefore, the commission cannot proceed at this point.
In terms of the overall, like sort of where that puts us on the board game, like on the chutes and ladders here, how close we are to the end. If the ultimate goal of this, that I think a lot of observers like me worry about, is that this would give the legislature effectively, indirectly, but it would effectively give them the power to remove prosecutors who are doing things they don't like. Does this bring things right back to square one, right back to the beginning of the board? Or is there an opportunity for the legislature to respond to the court effectively and in short order in a way that would put this back on track?
Well, it's not clear what the next steps are going to be. Nothing's going to happen before the end of the year because the Georgia legislature is a part-time legislature, and so they won't be back in business for this probably until the new year. They're meeting for redistricting right now. One legislator who was very much a proponent of the bill has apparently been quoted as saying this is a quick fix, that they can get it done in January. But this bill has really brought an outlash of criticism from some unexpected places. Both the District Attorneys Association and what are called the Solicitor Generals in Georgia, both those associations have come out strongly opposed to the bill. The National Prosecuting Attorneys Council has come out opposed to the bill. I don't know that the legislature expected prosecutors, who are generally, I think, favorites of our legislature, to be so strongly opposed. And there are a lot of problems with the bill, which was passed in a very hasty way, not just the glitch that the Supreme Court identified, but there are other problems with the bill as well. And I think it's quite possible that it might be the legislature will abandon this project, or if not, they'll have to do some significant reworking of the bill so that the commission doesn't have as much unregulated power as it seems to have under the bill that was passed this past year.
In terms of public interest and public pressure and how the legislature might sort of assess its own appetite for going back and trying to do this again, reopening this against the kind of elite pressure that you were describing there. I was recently in Atlanta for just a stop on my book tour. I was talking about a totally different matter, and this came up in conversation during the event, and there was kind of a roar from the audience where I was surprised that people felt very connected to this issue, seemed very worried about it. I was asked about it a number of times when I was in Georgia. Now, that may be a self-selecting sample of people who've heard me talk about it on television. But is it your sense that this is something that the press is following, that the public is following, that people know about the potential seriousness of what this could mean if this was allowed to go into effect, given what the legislature would have to do to get there?
Well, and Republican leaders, particularly in the state Senate, really, I think, overplayed their hand, because within a couple of days after the effective date of the law, they filed this pretty venal complaint against District Attorney Fani Willis to try to get the commission to remove her from office. And unfortunately, I think did themselves and the law a real damage in terms of credibility, because the complaint they filed was quite obviously political. It didn't have much merit to it. And so I think that was an immediate signal to people that, in fact, the bill could be abused. And that's what the Prosecuting Attorneys Association here in Georgia had been warning about, that it could be misused for political purposes. And sure enough, within a couple of days, the Republicans in the state Senate, the majority leader, I guess, proved them to be right.
Professor Clark Cunningham, law professor at Georgia State University, expert in legal ethics and constitutional law. I know that we bug you about this bill, this law, this commission all the time to help us stay abreast on it. We really appreciate your help.
Well, I compliment you guys for staying on top of this issue. It's an important one.
Well, I think it's important, too. And I realize that it's not exactly a huge media scrum that's following this issue, but I think this is an absolutely crucial ethical issue. And you've helped us more than anybody in understanding it. Thank you so much, sir. It's great to have you here.
Good evening.
Again, this situation in Georgia, you know, one of the things that's being adjudicated in several of the Trump civil and criminal cases is the question of whether or not former President Trump is allowed to impugn or attack or talk about people involved in the court system, the prosecutors, other people that are involved in essentially adjudicating these cases. Georgia is the one place where the legislature, the Republican-dominated legislature, gave themselves the power to not just criticize, but remove the prosecutor essentially for any reason they wanted. They did that while this case was pending against Trump. The law went into effect. It has been stopped essentially with this glitch at the Supreme Court right now. What Professor Cunningham was just describing in terms of the pressure that the legislature may feel as to whether or not that kind of action is proper, is okay, whether there might be too much pushback to it, is a snapshot of what it takes to hold on to a democracy. I mean, bad actors trying anti-democratic things try all sorts of stuff. Usually what they're doing is testing to see how much they can get away with. And then it's the project of everybody else who's trying to uphold the democracy to give them very clear feedback on what they can't get away with. It's happening right now in Georgia.